Well, admission to the G7 needs the unanimous agreement of all of its members. That's the U.S., Germany, the U.K., France, Italy, Canada, and Japan. Well, let's bring in Derek Chollet. Derek served as Assistant Defense Secretary for International Security Affairs under President Obama. He is now Senior Advisor for Security and Defense Policy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He joins me tonight from Washington, D.C. Derek, it's good to have you back on the day.
Great to be here, Brent.
I want you to take a listen to how the White House press secretary just last week was trying to sell the G7 summit in the U.S. in June. Take a listen.
The G7, the president wants to see this take place as America reopens, as we try to approach a place of normalcy where people go back to work, where people do recreational activities but socially distance while they do it. The president thinks no greater example of reopening in this transition to greatness would be the G7, and the G7 happening here and happening probably more towards the end of June.
All right, reopening with the G7. I mean, Derek, was Trump expecting his European allies to give him a photo op to show the country, yes, we are back to normal?
Well, apparently so. You have to recall this G7 summit has had somewhat of a troubled history. Trump's hosting of it has, because remember the initial idea that he floated long ago was that he was going to host the summit at one of his resort hotels in Florida, and that was quickly squelched as an idea. So now, as the press secretary suggests last week, the idea was to put it as another marker in the unveiling of the reemergence of the United States. But then, of course, that has been put aside, and now at the earliest they would have it is in September. But even that, I think, is very much up in the air right now.
That's up in the air. There's another plan that's up in the air, and that is the plan from Mr. Trump himself. He wants to reinvite Russia back into the G7. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a bad idea. We have to remember why Russia was kicked out of the G8, which was when it was called the G8, and that was after its invasion and illegal annexation of Crimea. Russia had been brought into the G7 that became the G8 in the 1990s as an effort to bring Russia into the community of nations. Over time, particularly as Vladimir Putin's more authoritarian system has taken hold, that became a more troubled relationship. And then in 2014, I think for good reason, the Obama administration and its partners in the G7 asked Russia not to attend anymore. Trump has been determined to bring Russia back into this grouping. He's floated this idea before. He's also let his frustrations be known about with the G7. Of course, it was several years ago that he got into a spat with Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after Canada had hosted a G7, and Trump refused to sign the leader statement, the first time the U.S. had ever done that. So, it seems to me a fairly transparent attempt to try to stock this grouping that he's never really been entirely happy with some of the leaders he feels more congenial towards.
Do you think that also explains his suggestion for expanding the G7 to include India? I mean, he did have a good meeting in India with Narendra Modi earlier this year.
Yeah, I think so. Now, I think it's important to note the G7 is an imperfect organization of leaders. And in fact, President Obama tried to elevate the role of the so-called G20 as something that he believed was more reflective of geopolitical realities of the 21st century. The G20, of course, still exists. One wonders if President Trump actually remembers that the G20 actually exists. The Saudis are supposed to be hosting the G20 as it stands later this year. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to include other countries into the G7 grouping. I just think it's a bad idea to include Russia.
Well, considering the state of affairs in the U.S. right now, I mean, do you expect that there will be a G7 summit in the U.S. this year? And I'm wondering, does President Trump, does he have the credibility among his counterparts to head a summit at this level?
Well, look, his credibility among, I think, most of his counterparts in the G7 right now was not starting very high and has been diminishing quite rapidly in recent weeks and months. Look, you could conceivably do a G7 at a place like Camp David, which of course is isolated. I think a lot of the questions will come down to the logistics of this, how the travel would work, the massive amount of preparation that normally goes into these G7 meetings to ensure that they're not just photo ops. And I think his fellow world leaders are very aware of what his true intentions are, it seems to be, with this meeting. And they're going to want, and they should ask for, a substantive agenda. And so far as I can tell, there's been no discussion of what a substantive agenda would look like at a G7 meeting whenever it takes place.
How do you explain Trump asking Angela Merkel to come over to the U.S. in June? I mean, is he tone deaf when it comes to the pandemic, or was he simply advised poorly?
Hard to tell. It could be one or the other or both. Look, it's hard to know how much thought has actually gone into some of these pronouncements about the G7. I mean, clearly Trump wanted to do it to show as host that he's in charge, that America's back and open for business again. But as we saw, reality quickly settled in, and the idea that it was going to be hosted at the end of June or had at the end of June is quickly put to the side. So now we're on to the fall. We're going to have to see where things are in the fall, what the pandemic looks like, and what the situation here in the United States looks like. Folks here in Washington are settling in for what many fear is going to be a long, long summer.
Yeah, speaking of the fall, let me ask you, Joe Biden, if he becomes the Democrats' nominee and then wins in November, will you be back at the White House or the State Department? Any idea?
You know, I've worked in Washington in and out of government long enough to know that it's a fool's errand to try to predict that stuff. All I can say is this country has got a lot of challenges that folks in and out of government are going to need to be working together to try to solve in the future. None of this is going to be easy for anyone come November.
All right. Well, if your plans change, Derek, keep us posted. Derek Chollet joining us tonight from Washington. We appreciate your time tonight, Derek.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yep.